Hello, this is Lauren of Wearing History, and I have a tutorial for you for how to sew a collar into a button-up shirt. For this, we're using the Montana Blouse pattern, but you can use any pattern that you have. First, we're going to mark our neckline. You need to mark your notches, your circles, and the fold back line. For the fold back line, I'm going to stick a pin right there so I can keep track. You can mark your circles with any kind of marking pen, but I've just done 2 little notches. So keep track of and compare to your pattern as you do this. I'm going to pin where those circles were, and then I'm going to sew from that point to the edge using 1/2 inch seam allowance or whatever your seam allowance is on your pattern. Then I'm going to clip it. You're going to clip in your corner, and then you're going to clip in really close to where the end of the stitch line is, like this. That prevents bulk. You can then flip it right side out, and you can give it a press. Your seam allowances should be facing up when you attach your collar. You're also going to want to turn under the edge of your facing and finish it if you haven't done that already. Take your collar, make sure you've cut 2. For mine, I have interfaced 1. My little girl. You're going to want to interface 1, and then you're going to pin them together with right sides together. On vintage patterns, they often don't call for interfacing, so I've done that on my own because I prefer the finish of interfacing. Pin your corners, pin your center, and pin down at the bottom of the seam allowance any edge that you're going to be stitching. And when you stitch a collar, you stitch around the outside edge. The edge with the notches should be the side that attaches to your neckline. This is sped up at about double speed, so obviously it takes a lot longer to pin, but just smooth everything out so that there's no weird wrinkles or anything. And then you're going to want to stitch around the outside. For this collar, I actually marked 1/2 inch in from the bottom, and I'm going to start stitching at that 1/2 inch all the way around because I find it easier to turn the edges up after it's attached. You'll see in a moment. Then you're going to clip your corners like you did with the turn back on the shirt front to eliminate any bulk. And then I'm going to trim down my seam allowance. On this pattern, the seam allowance was 1/2 inch. So I'm trimming it down to 1/4 inch. If you need to go back in and reshape those points, you can do that. You want to make sure that there's no bulk when you turn it so you can get a nice crisp point. Then you're going to turn it right side out, and you can go in there with a little point tool if you need to, wiggle it around with your fingers, and just make sure that the point gets nice. Don't push too hard or else it will distort the point. You just want to ease it over your fingers in between the little loop turner. Compare them to see if they're similar, and then you can press it. After it's pressed, I'm going to make sure that the interface side is facing out because I like the crisp edge facing towards me. So I'm going to pin one side of the collar and match that notch at the front. The very edge should match up exactly with where your seam allowance has turned facing up. And you're going to pin from that point and then match your notches. Make sure that everything is going in the correct direction so you don't get any weird bulk under there. Make sure your facing is also not going a wonky way, like make sure it's going a direction where it lays nice and flat. I use a lot of pins when I do a collar because I find that it's easier. After I've done one side of the front, I'm going to match the center back. To do this, when you cut it on the fold, I just make a little clip right at the fold line. And then you can continue easing it across. Make sure that both sides of it are flush with about 1/2 inch in, or wherever your seam allowance is, that's the edge it should lay flat. Do the same with the other side, matching the edge where the seam allowance is turned up with the edge of the sewn collar. This can take a little bit of wiggling around, just take your time. You can take things out and repin them if you don't think that it's laying flush. You can also baste down that facing before you do this if you think that's easier for you. I often will baste it down. I just forgot for this video. One of the hardest parts to get is that curve right between the neck and the shoulder, the front neck and the shoulder. So make sure that you really take your time as you go around this curve. It's one of the most extreme curves of the neckline. So you want to kind of pivot on your pin at about 1/2 inch in and make sure everything is nice and flush. You can see I really wiggled around my fabric. I felt it with my fingers to make sure that there was no bulk down there. You can take things out and repin them as you need to make sure that things ease between the points. Okay, that's what it looks like. Now you're going to sew that edge. You're going to catch only one side of the collar that you pinned with the neckline of the shirt. This is where the stitch line 1/2 inch in that we drew comes in handy because it's a lot easier to get in there and sew. Backstitch when you start and then go as slow as you need to, removing the pins as you go. And you can see with my other hand, I'm smoothing the shirt out from underneath so that I make sure that everything is laying nice and flat. Like I said, my seam allowance here is 1/2 inch, but it can vary depending on the pattern you're using. So flip the collar up and down however you need to make sure that the shirt underneath is nice and smooth. That really helps you to not get any wrinkles or bubbles underneath. You can also hand baste your collar to place before you stitch it if you think that that's easier for you. Sometimes when there's a very drastic curve, that really helps. And then you stitch it by machine after the basting's done. When you get to the end, you're going to back stitch. Now you can see that the collar seam allowance is done and it's facing up towards the inside of the collar. I'm now going to match my center back neck and I'm going to pull the seam allowance down. You fold it towards the inside and make sure that it just covers that line of stitching that you just did. I find matching center back first really helps me because that helps me to keep track of the grain for the rest of the piece. After the center back is done, I'm going to fold in that seam allowance, and you can see again how much easier it is once you've started at that 1/2 inch mark from the inside that I drew before I started my collar. This part right here at the neck is a little bit fiddly, just like when I said that the curve is the hardest part. So when you fold this down, it may take a little bit of playing with. Just when you pull it down with your hand, pay attention to the grain line so that your fingers are running up and down the same direction as the grain, and that really helps you to get the collar to lay nice and flat. You can see my fingers doing that. They go up and down along the grain line to make sure that everything's flat. You also want to pull the shirt away to make sure that it's laying nice underneath. You don't want to catch any bubbles or anything under there. After one side's done, I'll do the same on the other side. I got really lucky with a stripe right there where it matched. Turn it under, smooth it down with your fingers, cover the line, and then pin. This piece of serging right here is my facing. If you don't have a serger, you can turn that bit under. This is kind of the lazy way to finish it. Really, you should turn it under no matter what method you use of seam finishing. So I'm continuing to pin and cover that. This is sped up at double speed, so I obviously went much slower than this. Okay, now after that's done, you're going to stitch along there either by hand or by machine. I find that the hand is better for this because that front edge is going to show if I don't have my collar buttoned all the way up. So I'm just going to stitch invisibly right here. You can look up hand sewing stitches on other YouTube videos. I don't have any on my channel, but someone else probably has a really good one. Use a color thread that matches. Since this is sort of like a chambray type look with white threads, then I can use my white thread with no problem. The advantage of having a stripe that matches there and doing it by hand means I can match it exactly. So after this, I decided I was going to top stitch all the way around. Before this video, I had finished the hem. So I'm going to continue at the bottom of my facing right there, and then I'm going to top stitch using the 1/8 inch guide on my sewing machine foot. Your foot may have different lines, but mine has a little groove right there at 1/8 inch. So right now I'm going up one of the fronts, and then you'll see I will pivot with my needle down once I get up to the point near the collar. So pivot, and then I go up to the V, and I go to that stitch line, and I pivot, and then I come down the collar using 1/8 inch. Right here it gets fussy every time because of that bulk, so sometimes I have to lift up my foot and put it down again, but I make sure my needle's down so that I don't lose my place. To put your needle down, you just turn your sewing machine wheel and it should raise it up or down. Continuing across at 1/8 inch seam allowance, 1/8 inch top stitching, pivot again at the other end of the collar, and then I go back down. Try to aim for around the same spot when you get down to the collar as where you finished it on the other side. Pivot, go out to 1/8 inch, and then continue down the other side. It's going to cut here in a second, but you get the general idea. This is how you sew a collar into a button-up shirt. I hope this has helped you. You can get patterns at wearinghistory.clothing or Wearing History on Etsy.